It is really no wonder Congress can't get it together on a spending bill, because right now, you, the American taxpayer, spending $870 billion just in interest this year on the country's $34 trillion debt and counting. In fact, this is the fastest growing part of the budget, even bigger than the budget for the Department of Defense. Well, yesterday, congressional leaders said they've had a deal to delay funding talks for a week with a continuing resolution. And joining us now to discuss, Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union, Brandon Arnold. Brandon, here we go again. The congressional leaders also claim they have a deal on 6 of the 12 appropriations bills. However, they still have to take these back to their chambers and vote on them. What do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, it's just unbelievable that we're in this position again. Another shutdown averted at the last minute by a congressional deal, a short-term patch once again. And yes, to answer your question, Jan, I do think this will pass. I do think this will pass the House this afternoon and the Senate later today. But then the real work has to actually begin in earnest for once. We actually need to see these bills. They've been agreed to but not released publicly. And we need to look with a fine-tooth comb to see what's in there. All we know right now is the total spending levels. But as is the case in many instances, the devil's in the details, right, and we haven't seen the details yet.
So the CR for sure is likely to get passed. That just buys lawmakers basically a week. We know that the details of these other appropriations bills are going to be released on Sunday. Likely to pass the Senate, it appears. The White House has signaled they would sign it. But what about in the House?
The House becomes a much trickier situation because you have Republicans in control of the House that have very, very broad disagreements on the nature of federal spending. Some want to increase defense significantly and are unsatisfied with the amount of defense increases in these bills. Some of them are very frustrated with the situation in Ukraine, any funding that goes to Ukraine, and I don't expect that to be included here, but they have drawn a line in the sand on this particular issue. So you just have a conference that's pulling in a lot of different directions, and Speaker Johnson needs to be very, very careful here with such a thin majority of Republicans in control of the House to make sure he is not angering any large constituencies within his conference. And
you can see, though, when we talk about the debt right now, the debt almost $1 trillion in interest alone because of the $34 trillion that we owe here in America. So you say the real fight is over these riders, which are policy provisions that can turn off funding for specific programs or regulations as the GOP tries to rein in some of this spending. How important are these riders for the GOP when you think about how much we need to rein in spending for the IRS, the FTC, the EPA?
Yeah, they're critically important because all of the things that have been done by Bidenomics, when you talk about high inflation, when you talk about a stagnant economy in many ways, those things can be defunded in a very targeted fashion. You can defund portions of Bidenomics, but you can only do so if you have Republican unity. You have to prioritize which of these things are the worst. You mentioned some of the agencies, I think, that have been the biggest offenders: the Federal Trade Commission, the Internal Revenue Service. I would say the Department of Labor as well has been very aggressive towards small businesses in particular. So you can defund some of the activities in these agencies in a targeted fashion. Unfortunately, we haven't had enough Republican unity yet in order to really get these across the finish line.
And inflation,
not the appropriations bills.
Exactly. And inflation not going away, as we know, meaning less of a chance for the feds to cut those interest rates. So what could the administration do aside from cutting spending to help American taxpayers right now?
Well, spending is certainly the first thing, but the second thing is having a supply-oriented agenda. And that means just making more stuff in America, supporting our manufacturing sector, supporting our farmers, supporting the energy industry. He has been so hostile to the energy industry during the course of his term that that's such a huge factor when you talk about inflation, we talk about infrastructure, logistics, and so forth. So supporting the growth of our manufacturing sector, I think, would be key. We haven't really seen that from this administration because he's been so deferential to labor unions and environmentalists.
Yep, scaling back regulations and a better trade policy would certainly help. All right, Brandon Arnold. Always great to see you, Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union. Have a great weekend. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jen.